Dick Cheney's visit to Canada. That's the entire topic of tonight's byline. He was welcomed with placards, banners, and denunciations, called a war criminal by a sitting member of parliament, a member of the official opposition, no less. There were calls for his arrest. Vile protesters attempted to shut down his speech in Vancouver, shouting obscenities at those who tried to walk through their human blockade. I have a different reaction to Dick Cheney than the people outside and the unthinking mumblings of those in the media party. I say, thank God for Dick Cheney. Play a thought experiment with me, especially all of you people that hate George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Imagine they had lost the election in 2000 and Al Gore and Joe Lieberman were in charge when 9/11 hit. There is no doubt that the attacks would have happened. Islamic fascists don't really care if Americans elect Democrats or Republicans. To them, all Americans, all Canadians for that matter, are infidels that need to be destroyed. So if Bush and Cheney had lost in 2000, those attacks would still have happened. Would we have been better off with Al Gore in charge? Joe Lieberman I have some faith in, but Al Gore is a man of pomp, not substance. The entirety of Western civilization might still be in full-blown fetal position if we had to rely on Al Gore to see us through the days following 9/11. As you will hear in the interview and can read in his book, In My Time, Cheney was uniquely prepared to handle the immediate crisis when there were still planes in the sky and it was unclear what the exact threat was 10 years ago. He doesn't say that, but I do. Cheney had been working in Washington since 1969. He worked with the Nixon administration, worked for President Ford as his chief of staff, then became a 5-time congressman for Wyoming. For most people, that would be one heck of a career, but Cheney went on, becoming Secretary of Defense under the presidency of George Bush Sr. During that time, Cheney was central to the First Gulf War, the ousting of Manuel Noriega from Panama, and the taking of the peace dividend after the Berlin Wall fell. Dating back to the Cold War, he had been through training on making sure the United States ensured a continuity of government, meaning if the president or vice president were killed, the right process was in place to make sure the next person in line was safe and secure, that a functioning government was there. While people in this country may have qualms about waterboarding and sleep deprivation, we need to remember that one of the most well-respected human rights experts in the world and a Canadian, Michael Ignatieff, supported sleep deprivation and waterboarding as necessary.
I think you can draw a relatively clear line between interrogations that subject a terrorist suspect to a certain kind of stress, certain kind of sleep deprivation, certain disorientation, and you can keep that clear of torture. I don't want.
On the specifics of waterboarding, specifically of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ignatieff wrote positively, even after he'd entered Canadian electoral politics. He wrote, "I submit that we would not be waterboarding Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, immersing him in water until he experiences the torment of nearly drowning if our intelligence operatives did not believe it was necessary to crack open the Al-Qaeda network that he commanded." But to be clear, Ignatieff does call waterboarding torture, but says it was necessary, just as he once saw targeted assassinations as necessary. I say that part of the reason North America has been free from a large-scale attack similar to 9/11 is partly because Dick Cheney and men like him were there to help make the hard choices. Cheney does not shy away from tough questions. He takes them head-on in his book and in this interview. And that's the byline. I hope you enjoyed the 30-minute conversation we are about to bring you with the former vice president. The interview begins right after this short break. Vice President Cheney, your book does not give a lot of mentions to Canada, but the ones that do seem pretty special to you. Fishing on the Miramichi, the Eagle River in Newfoundland, right, and quite particularly the Dean River here in British Columbia.
Right.
What's so special about these places? Tell us about your love of fishing.
Well, I got started as a youth growing up in Wyoming, and over the years I had some great invitations, and so I love to fish for steelhead here in British Columbia. For years I fished the Dean and the Babine. I'm not able to be there this year, obviously, but it's a magnificent fishery. It's one of the world's finest, and of course in the Miramichi and Ristigouche and the Eagle, you're fishing for Atlantic salmon. So I'm an eager, avid fisherman, and I love to do it in Canada.
And we've got some of the best spots here in this country.
Absolutely.
Your book opens not with fishing, but with what defined your vice presidency, I would say, and that's September 11th.
Right.
You were in charge while President Bush was moved to a secure location. You've got pictures in the book of you being pushed to a secure location yourself, your Secret Service man behind you, hand pushing you down the stairs. Walk us through that and what was going through your mind in the first hours after the attacks.
Well, when it first began, I was in my office in the West Wing of the White House. And then the Secret Service came in and moved me rapidly. This was after the World Trade Center had been hit twice. And we got a report of a third plane that was headed for Crown. That's what the code name is for the White House, at a very high rate of speed. And that's when they evacuated me down to a bunker underneath the White House, which is where I spent the day. We had to deal with the question of getting all the airplanes down out of the sky in case there were more hijacked aircraft up there. I'd been told at one point that 6 had been hijacked. Turned out to be 4. 2 of those were false reports. And the other thing we had to do then was to make certain that we preserved the continuity of government. That is, that should something happen to the president or myself, that the next in line, in this case Speaker Hastert of the House, was in a secure location so the government could continue to function no matter what actually happened in New York and Washington.
And you'd been through that before in some of your previous jobs, yes. Working as Chief of Staff to President Ford, being Secretary of Defense. But did you ever think that you would be the man in charge? Because I'm assuming for a while you were calling shots while President Bush was moved to somewhere where he was both secure and able to communicate.
Right, and the communications were spotty, I guess is the way I would describe it. But clearly the president, even though he was not in Washington, he was in touch all the time. We held a National Security Council meeting where he was at Offutt Air Force Base right outside Omaha, and most of us were in Washington. So it was just a matter of keeping him secure until we could find out exactly how many planes had been hijacked. We got a lot of false reports early in the day. We had a report that a car bomb had gone off at the State Department, a report that an airplane was headed for Camp David, a report that there was a threat to Air Force One from an airplane that had been hijacked. All of those turned out to be false reports. Then, of course, the one about plane headed for Crown turned out to be American 77, which flew into the Pentagon. So there was a fog of war, I guess is the way I describe it. And but the president was very much in control, in communication with me throughout that period of time. We had a number of phone calls until he could get back, and that night then address the nation.
10 years later, the war on terror is still going on. Recently, ahead of the 10th anniversary of 9/11, Prime Minister Stephen Harper was asked about it, and he said that when it comes to security, Islamicism or Islamic terrorism remains the greatest threat. He's criticized harshly for that, both here in Canada and outside the country. Is he wrong?
I don't think so. My biggest concern today when I think about threat is the possibility that there'll be another major attack, but next time they'll have deadlier weapons, not just airline tickets and box cutters. I worry very much about the possibility of a group of terrorists getting their hands on a biological agent of some kind or a nuclear device and setting one of those off in the middle of one of our cities. And that would be devastating, obviously. The death toll could run into the hundreds of thousands. And I think we have to worry about that. I think in this day and age, with that technology widely available to a number of states now, the possibility that ultimately a terrorist organization could acquire the capacity to launch such an attack is very real.
And I do want to ask you about states that could go rogue later on, but I want to stick with 9/11 right now and fighting the war on terror. The fact is that there has not been an attack on American soil anywhere near the scale of 9/11. There has been Fort Hood and of course John Allen Muhammad, which caused a great deal of tension and terror around Washington. But there's been no big coordinated attack. There have been terrorist attacks around the world since then, but nothing in the U.S., nothing in Canada. Do you think that that has led the populations of both of our countries to start to think that this isn't the threat that people at the top see it as?
Well, there's some of that, I suppose. The farther we get away from the actual events of 9/11 without a follow-on attack, I think it's easier for people to forget what that morning was like, or to be relaxed and say, well, that was a one-off affair, it'll never happen again. But if you've had the opportunity to spend as much time on it as I did, it really shaped the rest of our presidency, the Bush-Cheney administration. You have to be very concerned that the problems still exist. We've had reports in recent months, for example. There's a report in the New York Times and the Washington Post of North Korea buying technology from Pakistan in order to enrich uranium to make weapons based on uranium enrichment technology. And they've now got the centrifuges, they've got the uranium feedstocks, and they're in operation. And they were able to go to Pakistan, according to A.Q. Khan, who was sort of the father of the Pakistan program, and pay officials to give them that technology.
You say that the war on terror helped define the Bush-Cheney administration. It's also helped vilify you. I mean, you've been called some pretty nasty names in your own country here.
Like Darth Vader.
You're Darth Vader, right. Yes. That was one of many names, probably the more humorous of them. Mm-hmm. There's been protests about you coming to Canada, though, including calls from our own opposition critic for immigration. He wrote to the immigration minister saying he shouldn't be allowed in Canada, and arrest him if he gets here and charge him with war crimes. What do you say to the people that view you as a war criminal, that want you brought up on charges in The Hague over your role in enhanced interrogation?
Well, I think the ones that I've heard on the subject don't know much of the substance and the details of what actually transpired or what happened. We did, in fact, have a program of enhanced interrogation techniques. It was very carefully prepared. It was done with the approval of the President and the National Security Council, and with the Justice Department reviewing it every step of the way to make certain that what we did not violate any international statutes or any treaty that we're a part of, that in fact everything that was done was perfectly legal. There's the notion, I heard one of the critics on television since I arrived here in Vancouver saying this was done to dozens, hundreds of people, and it was done by the military. No. Waterboarding, for example, was used on exactly 3 individuals, the foremost being Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the admitted mastermind of 9/11 and killed some 3,000 Americans that morning, and also beheaded Daniel Pearl, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He's the one who was where waterboarding was most appropriate, but it was only done very carefully and with Justice Department sign-off that we were in fact within our rights and the laws and responsibilities that we had to worry about.
All right, more with Vice President Dick Cheney and his book, In My Time. We're in Vancouver at the Vancouver Club and the Bonmont Book Club. More coming up, including some more questions about enhanced interrogation. Brian Lilley here with Vice President Dick Cheney. We're talking about his book, In My Time, from the Vancouver Club. Brought here to Canada by the Bonmont Book Club. Vice President Cheney, you were saying before the break about enhanced interrogation that critics of yours have said it's been used on hundreds of people. You say exactly 3. The other than waterboarding.
Waterboarding was used on 3.
Waterboarding.
There were some other techniques that were used on a slightly broader group. But enhanced interrogation was a very special program limited to very few people, run by the CIA. It did not involve the U.S. military, and it was not done at Guantanamo. It was done in separate facilities.
Separate facilities. Are the techniques used in enhanced interrogation torture?
No. The techniques that used in enhanced interrogation are used on our own people in training. And the escape and evasion practices, for example. One of the pilots of one of the aircraft that was hijacked and crashed on 9/11 had actually been through that process himself as a pilot. So the techniques that we used were techniques that we had trained our own people with. So it was, again, it was very carefully done. It was managed by the CIA. It was fully sanctioned and authorized by the Justice Department and by the President and the National Security Council.
Now, I know that you, being outside of the United States, you're loath to criticize your current president, because you are an American, he is still your president, but you did, and you talk about it in the book, there was a bit of a public spat between yourself and President Obama when he started talking about arresting and charging civil servants who had carried out the orders and suggested this, and you called for specific memos to be released. What is in those memos that makes you think everything's in the clear, or does say that everything's in the clear?
Well, the memos I asked for came about as a result of studies done by the CIA itself on the results of enhanced interrogation. Did we learn anything? Did it prevent any attacks? What was it able to produce? And it's clear from those in-house studies that were done by the agency that it was a very successful program, especially where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was concerned. The reports were classified. President Obama, in the early days of his administration, released all the information to the public about the techniques, but not the results. So I went and made a formal request that they release these memos that talked about the results, and they eventually were declassified as well. So they're available now publicly.
There's a young Canadian being held at Guantanamo Bay that's created a lot of controversy here in this country. His name's Omar Khadr. His father had been an associate of Osama bin Laden. He was known as a financier, the money man for Al-Qaeda, helped finance the attacks. Omar Khadr was arrested on the battlefield at 15 for the death of Army Specialist Christopher Spears. He's since admitted to his role. He's been convicted, and despite the jury recommendation of 40 years in prison, he was given an 8-year term as a plea bargain, including that after a year, which is almost up, he could apply to be transferred back to Canada. Our justice system is a lot different than yours. He could very well be walking the streets of this country in a year. How do you feel about that, knowing that someone has admitted to this, been convicted, and after 2 years post-conviction could be let go in his early 20s?
Yeah. I don't know the specifics of the case, and I'd be reluctant to comment at any length. It sounds to me like if he did in fact admit to killing a soldier, these are not the terrorists, the members of Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda organization aren't recognized as soldiers. They don't wear uniforms. They do launch terrorist attacks to kill civilians. In this particular case, again, I just don't know the details. I would have strong feelings that someone like that who has confessed should serve significant sentence, but I'm not in a position to make a detailed judgment. I just don't know enough.
Outside of the war on terror, there are a lot of other threats to Western nations, allies like Canada and the United States. Where would you say the greatest threat lies? Is it with North Korea and their attempts to get nuclear weapons? Is it with Iran and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad? Or is it from a country that a lot of people look at as benevolent on our side, that being China?
Well, there's been a lot of developments, obviously, with respect to China. China's been enormously successful in recent years economically. Their economy is very much interwoven or linked, if you will, to the U.S., and I would assume also to Canada. That's a significant development. And there are forces at work that hopefully we can manage on both sides so that whatever competition there is economic rather than ultimately military. But in terms of threats, I think we have to work, certainly in the United States, to do everything we can to remain competitive, to develop new technologies, to deal with our long-term debt problem and need for employment opportunities for our people. That's a significant challenge that we face as well, too.
Is the debt problem that the U.S. is facing, Canada not so much, but the United States and Europe are facing significant debt problems, and it's going to have an impact in terms of the ability to finance defense. House Armed Services Committee this week, they were talking about 150,000 Army and Marine troops being cut due to budget cuts in the most recent plan. The French have pulled back. I mean, they had to pull back their aircraft carrier from Libya. The Brits built 2 aircraft carriers, figured out they didn't have the money to run them or enough money to put planes on them. Are we in the West being defeated by ourselves and our budget problems for social programs, entitlements, however you want to describe them?
Well, certainly in the U.S., we've got a major debt problem. I think it's driven primarily by our entitlements programs and by the health program and Social Security and so forth. And that's where the bulk of spending is in our budget. Defense is a significant amount, but it's already been diminished steadily over the years. When I was Secretary of Defense 20 years ago, we had 18 active divisions in the United States Army. Today we've got 10. If we cut out 150,000 troops in terms of further budget reductions, the Army's going to be smaller than it's been for a very, very long time. And I don't think the world's necessarily gotten any safer.
Well, it hasn't.
But we've already saved a lot of money after the Cold War ended. We downsized our force by about 25%. The Defense Department used to have 4 million people in it when I was in charge, military and civilian. Today it's maybe 2/3 that. So it's a situation I think we have to be very careful of. I worry that we'll go looking to the Defense Department to solve the long-term debt problem, and that won't work. The long-term debt problem is primarily one of entitlements.
If the long-term debt problem keeps growing, is that as significant a threat to the safety and security of the United States and allied countries as threats from the outside? Because if you have to give up your armed forces, then what do you have left?
Yeah, we clearly can't do that. And I think there'll be a lot of resistance to the idea that we can somehow solve our debt problem with major reductions in defense. I think that would be a very, very serious mistake.
All right. Speaking with Vice President Dick Cheney here in Vancouver. He's a guest at the Bonmot Book Club. When we come back in just a moment, we'll ask him about whether we're making the same mistakes we did before 9/11. Stick around. Brian Lilley here in Vancouver, speaking with Vice President Dick Cheney. He is the author of In My Time, a personal and political memoir. And you've come here to talk about your book. A lot of it deals with your time at various positions. You know, you worked in the Ford administration as Chief of Staff. You were the Defense Department Secretary of Defense during the first Bush administration, and were in charge of military operations that took out Noriega and Desert Storm. But you mentioned just before the break about cutting Defense Department by about 25% since you took over in the late 80s. Was that a mistake? Did that help lead to some of the security problems that we saw in the late 90s in terms of Al-Qaeda being able to make moves on USS Cole, on embassies, and eventually 9/11? Was drawing down on military intelligence and so on a mistake that led to some of what happened on 9/11?
Well, I don't think so. But what happened, of course, in 89 and 90 was the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall came down. The Soviets withdrew their forces from Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union went out of business in 1991. And there was, we'd been in a situation where we had a commitment through NATO to have 10 divisions in Europe within 10 days of a decision to mobilize. And we kept 5 divisions forward deployed in Europe and 5 more here at home ready to deploy. And we'd operated that way for years. But when that mission went away, when the Soviet Union was no more, we felt, and I think correctly so, that we could legitimately reduce our forces, start to focus on a regional strategy than on the prospects of an all-out global conflict. And so the cuts we made, I think, in the 90s were justified. The other thing that happened was that we also, in the Reagan years, had laid the groundwork for a good, solid military force. When President Reagan came in, we had a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems. We hadn't purchased anything for a long time, and we used the Reagan years in the 80s to really rebuild our military in significant ways. It benefited us all up to the present day. The result was that we were in pretty good shape, I think. But now when we start to talk about, after we've just been through Iraq and Afghanistan and the war on terror for nearly 10 years now, we really put the force under heavy strain. We used to drive our Humvees 8,000 miles a year. Now we've been driving them 40,000 miles a year. That's got to be repaired. A lot of that equipment's got to be replaced. So there's a big financial nugget out there that has to be satisfied. And at the same time, if you start to take massive cuts out of the defense budget, we're not going to be able to replenish the force the way we need to.
Now, you mentioned keeping 5 divisions in Europe during that. That was all part of NATO, and Canada kept troops in Lahr and other bases throughout Europe during that time period as well. Everybody drew down at the end of the Cold War. Right. When Afghanistan came, though, the Americans went in, did the heavy lifting. Canada joined shortly thereafter, Britain, and the Dutch. But outside of that, there was always complaints that other countries wouldn't offer up enough troops. A French ambassador took me to task once saying, well, we sent in a lot of planes, but the Germans would have caveats on their troops. There seems to be a reluctance to put boots on the ground. Is that a problem for the alliance? Is the alliance still viable when you look at how they handled Afghanistan and how they've handled Libya?
Well, I think the alliance is very important and has been for a long time. In a sense, Afghanistan was the first time we really ever went to war as an alliance, as NATO, when we ended up with a lot of nations sending forces. We were concerned in the United States that there were so many restrictions placed on some of the troops that they weren't able to perform as active a role as you might hope. Our Canadian friends and allies, the Brits, the Australians have all been great. And I know Canada suffered a number of casualties as a result of that commitment.
When the Kandahar district, there was debate about whether we would continue on with that at one point a few years ago, and the report came back and said if you can find 1,000 troops from other countries to come in and help that, bolster, this was before the surge became an idea, that we can stay and we can do an effective job. And the call went out to NATO, and in the end it was your troops that came in to aid us because nobody else would step forward. I'd look at that and say that there's a problem with the alliance there if people aren't willing to put forward their troops if they're going to be in harm's way.
Yeah. I used to make speeches when I was Defense Secretary back in the 89 to 93 period about the amount contributed financially by our various alliance partners. And the U.S. always was in the lead, both in terms of the dollar amount as well as the percentage of our budget or the amount of troops and so forth. We expected that. We were the biggest power that was involved, and so we anticipated that we'd have to do more than anybody else. But there were times when it was very frustrating because there was not a significant level of effort from the other members of the alliance in terms of the size force they maintained, how much they were willing to spend, and so forth. We sometimes felt as though our NATO allies were getting something of a free ride off of our commitments. Now, let's say Afghanistan has been somewhat different because, in fact, many countries have made commitments and participated, and that's been appreciated. Libya, that hasn't happened on my watch. It was obviously after we left the government, and I'm still, like many people, waiting to see who's going to take over, what kind of government is going to replace Muammar Gaddafi. But I'm glad to see him gone, and I think it's an interesting story if it all works out the way I think most of us hope it does.
If I could end with another international organization, that's the United Nations. It's been in headlines for the last while because of the Palestinian bid for statehood. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went to the UN and started talking about some of the things that have happened in the past, some of the things that are happening now, including Lebanon, controlled by Hezbollah, being on the Security Council, and said you can't make this stuff up. He expressed a deep frustration with the UN. Is it still relevant as an organization, or has it become a tool used for anti-Western countries to beat up on the Americans and others?
I get as frustrated as anybody I know with the United Nations. I can think back over my time in government, and mostly it was frustration. There have been exceptions to that. At the time that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and we needed to go get some statement that there was an international effort to free Kuwait and to restore the rightful government, which we did, and we got support for that out of the UN. They voted, Security Council voted a resolution authorizing the use of force for that purpose, and I thought that was a positive move. But on balance, over time, it can be a very, very frustrating organization to work with.
All right, final question. Have you picked anybody in the Republican primaries yet? Are you keeping a close eye on that?
I am keeping a close eye on it. I haven't picked anybody, haven't tipped my hand one way or the other. I fully expect I will support my party's nominee once that person's selected.
Will you pick somebody before they pick the nominee? Will you go public at some point?
It depends. I'll watch and see what develops. It's still early. We've got several months left before we get into the hot and heavy primary season of Iowa and New Hampshire and so forth. But I'm looking forward to what I think will be a very interesting political year.
All right. Mr. Vice President, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.